Molt bé, bon dia, gràcies a tots per venir. Us presento el Matthieu Cartigny, que estem molt contents de tenir-lo aquí amb nosaltres, perquè és un gran expert en corrents de terbolesa, els ha estudiat des de tots els punts de vista possibles i escales, des de treballs de camp, monitorització in situ, ara en veureu alguns exemples, fins a més a nivell d'aflorament, i a més en totes les escales temporals. Vol dir que espero que sigui una xerrada que pugui ser interès de tots vosaltres, amb un background, m'imagino, divers, pel que veig. Per tant, res, moltes gràcies. Many thanks to Matthieu and also to the International Association of Sedimentologists that sponsored part of this trip, and also GEO3BCN that also gave us the opportunity to use this space and to be here, and also they funded part of the travel. So thank you very much, and yeah, your turn.
I think the microphone might be live now. Let me know if that doesn't work. Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and an honor. I think to me, I think Barcelona must be one of the biggest cities I should say, the most marine sedimentologists in the world. I don't think there's any other city where there are so many marine sedimentologists combined. So it's great to be here and to present my work here, and I look forward to seeing what the latest research is here, and to hear what you make of the research I present to you here today. And before I dive into turbidity currents, I want to say a little bit about the this talk is part of the International Association of Sedimentologists lecture tour. So a bit of a plug for the sponsor here. The IAS, the International Association of Sedimentology, is a very friendly and welcoming, dynamic community. So I really recommend, if you're not a member, to look it up. Membership is really affordable. And especially if you're an early career researcher, there are some huge benefits to a membership. Fieldwork grants, travel grants, there's a great summer school. So if you work in any of the broader areas of sedimentology and you're not yet a member, please consider a membership to the IAS. Right, so far for that. And now let's go back to turbidity currents. So during this talk, I'm going to start from the beginning. What is a turbidity current? And then that will be fairly short, hopefully. And then why do we study turbidity currents? And hopefully I'll convince you to study turbidity currents. And then the main question is, if we know that we want to study turbidity currents, then how? How should we study turbidity currents? And you might have already seen from the title that, in my view, one of the best ways to study turbidity currents is to actually go down to the ocean floor and measure them in situ. So during the majority of the presentation, I'll give you a highlight of some of the work we have done in monitoring turbidity currents and what we have learned so far. And I'll highlight some of the big open questions that we're currently working on. So that is the plan. So first of all, let's start back to basics. What are turbidity currents? So this is typically the image that comes to mind when you think of a turbidity current. You stir up some sediment and some water, and you release it in a tank like this on a tabletop, and you get this this dilute flow with a big head with these big billows on the top that slowly makes its way to the bottom of the tank. And unfortunately, when it comes to real scale, what we often see if you open the textbook is pretty much a copy of that table tank flume, just drawn on a very big scale in an ocean basin, because basically that's the best we have, or we had. We don't have really a lot of direct observations, so often it comes to these artist impressions when it comes to having a visual image of what a turbidity current is. Then, of course, how do you make turbidity currents? Well, the typical idea is you start them by bringing some sediment in suspension on the shelf, be that with a landslide or some storm or internal waves or maybe human interaction, trawling, or as we just discussed, dense water cascading. Could it be a trigger? But in any case, that's more expertise here than from me. I'll pick it up once the sediment is in suspension and start to move down the slope in these turbidity currents, bringing its sediment down to the deeper ocean floor. In 3D, what we have is we typically have these shelves incised by canyons. Again, we have these artist impressions of the dilute turbulent clouds bringing sediment to these submarine fans. And then we have the deposits on the fans, these typical fining upward sequences representing individual turbidity currents. And those deposits are studied very well, like these examples of Zumaya here, large stacks of old sea floors where you can study turbidite deposits in a lot of detail. Right, so hopefully that refreshed everyone again about what turbidity currents are, and that brings us to the next point. Why should we care about turbidity currents? They happen somewhere in the dark, deep ocean, so why should we make such an effort to study them? And I think there are several reasons why we should do that. And first of all, I think we should do it because they play an integral part of our system Earth. If you look at this Bengal fan, all built up of turbidite deposits, being thousands of kilometers long, hundreds of kilometers wide, tens of kilometers thick, these are massive amounts of sediments. So, and it's not just sediment, there is also carbon in there, there is plastic, there's pollution in there. So surely if we want to understand our Earth as an integrated system, this is one of the processes that we should know about. But of course, there are also practical implications. At the moment, there is still a significant amount of our hydrocarbons is stored in turbidite reservoirs. And if you want to efficiently extract that, you're going to have to understand these turbidite deposits on the seafloor. And what's more, turbidites are actually forming a threat to our present use of the internet. Much of the internet we use, as soon as anything comes from another continent, the data doesn't actually travel through satellites. More than 99% of the data intercontinental goes through these telecommunication cables on the seafloor. And turbidity currents have a tendency to break those cables. And especially in the current day where we are so dependent on the internet, this could be a real issue. For example, a turbidity current caused by the Tonga volcanic eruption, when was it, somewhere last year, disrupted the internet to Tonga. So in the middle of a crisis, you take away the internet and you can imagine the chaos that creates. Here's another example where the internet slowed down here from Nigeria down to South Africa for several weeks because turbidity currents broke a telecommunication cable. And I'll come back to this example at the end of the talk with some more details. So another reason why I think we should study turbidity currents. And then, of course, finally, I think we should study turbidity currents because 2/3 of our Earth is covered in ocean. And there are many processes transporting sediment around our oceans, but turbidity currents are certainly one of the important ones when it comes to the ocean floor. So if we want to understand the ocean and the planet as a whole, we need to understand what's happening on the seafloor. And especially in this time and age, there is a strong pressure on the oceans as we extract lots of resources from the oceans. There's a wide recognition that we need to understand what's happening in the ocean to explore, to extract those resources in a sustainable manner. So at the moment, we are living in the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science to actually recognize this increased need to study the oceans. And that means that this is a great time to actually study turbidity currents and the ocean floor because it comes with big projects like the Seabed 2030 project, where they aim to map the ocean down to 100-meter resolution by 2030. Which is a big step from where it was. A while back, we were at 15% of the ocean floor being mapped at 100 meters and the rest at 5 kilometers. So this is quite an exciting time to study turbidity currents because there is a lot of more data from the ocean floor coming in. And to show you what I think is going to happen when it comes to turbidity current research, we can compare the turbidity current system with river systems. And so if we, at the moment, we study sediment transport at the ocean floor and we use maps at a resolution of often 5 kilometers. If you imagine studying a river at a resolution of 5 kilometers, then your satellite images look like this. This is a picture of a river at 5 kilometers. So this is a typical ocean floor picture we have that we try to study submarine channels or submarine canyons with. And hopefully, if that plan works out, by 2030, we should have at least maps downsampled to 100 meters. You can imagine if going from that picture to this picture, it's going to make a big step change in our understanding of these oceanic systems. And once we're able to map the ocean floor in a higher resolution, we can repeat map it, and we can actually start to get a much more dynamic picture of what's happening on the ocean floor. And that will, I think, really stimulate and make a step change in our understanding of turbidity current systems, because we can start to see what's happening. So I think that's why we should study turbidity currents. It has important implications, and we are now having the technology to actually get the bathymetries and to study them in the detail we need. And then the next question is, well, how do we then study turbidity currents? So as I said, one of the important ways over the last decades has been these tabletop experiments. They have generated a lot of insight in what we think turbidity currents are. These dilute, turbulent flows that travel down to the ocean floor. And the other option is to look at the rock record. Studies of the rock record over many decades have given us a lot of insight what turbidity currents are. But I think we could still do better, and to explore that in a bit more detail, I would like to compare how we study rivers to how we can study turbidity currents. So I want to analyze how we know everything we know about rivers, and then see what would change if we, instead of rivers, we would study turbidity currents. So here's a river, and typically if you study that on the smaller scale, when it comes to sediment transport or fluid flow, you get into the area of the engineers that make high resolution models. And then at least in the UK, you start to link it up to the morphology. And for that, we typically have geographers. They go into wading suits into the rivers, and they actually map the morphology of the river and map how that changes over time. And as long as these rivers migrate to the landscape on long time scales, we eventually build up the geological record. And this is where the geologists come in. And I think in between the engineers, the geographers, and the geologists, we have a very clear understanding of what a river is. And I think it's insightful to now replace the rivers up here with turbidity currents. So what's going to change in this picture when we go to turbidity currents? I think the main thing that changes is the geographers fall out. There's no wading suit that's going to help you if you're going to have to go down to 2 kilometers. And this leads to a big problem. That means that our morphologies are falling out. And that means, I think, for a long time that we have been stuck in a situation where we have engineers doing very high resolution, small scale models, and we have geologists doing very large scale outcrop work. And how the interactions between the geologists and the engineers is very difficult. My background is as a mechanical engineer, and I've spent the last 2 decades in geology departments, and getting engineers and geologists to talk in a sensible way is just very difficult. If one speaks in seconds and the other one speaks in millions of years, it's difficult to find that common ground. And that's why I think we should replace these geographers. And that is what's happening now, and that's why I think we should study these turbidity currents now. We can start to automate the geographers. We can just use these remote operated vehicles, the autonomous underwater vehicles, the monitoring systems, and we can get back that morphology and the detailed interaction between fluid flow, morphology and geological models. And I think when this circle closes, as it does now, we can really start to understand turbidity currents as well as we understand rivers. And I think that is about time. I mean, if we can send rovers to other planets, we can send drones into our skies, surely we should have the technology to map the ocean floor and monitor the ocean floor in more detail. Right, so I hope I have convinced you that we should be studying turbidity currents and that we should be using the latest technology to go down to the ocean floor and to actually see what sediment transport is like and how it impacts the morphology. And for the remaining part of the talk, I want to talk you through several of these systems that we have been working on the last 10 years or so. I'll start with a very small system in a Canadian fjord, Butte Inlet. Then I'll talk a bit about a medium-scale, fully oceanic system offshore California. And then finally, I want to bring you to one of the largest systems on our planet, the Congo submarine canyon offshore Congo and Angola. And of course, these are all very big initiatives, and they're by no means my work. This is actually the work I'll presenting is of a very large group of people. And any of the work I'll present will always be with one of the frequent collaborators in the UK, Peter Telling at my university, Mike Clare at the National Oceanography Centre, and Dan Parsons at Loughborough University. And then, of course, there are many more collaborators on the different projects that I'll introduce when we get there. Okay, so first let's go to the smallest system here in Butte Inlet. So here we are looking at British Columbia, Canada. And this is a great system to study turbidity currents. It might at first seem quite confusing, like you were talking about the ocean floor, and now we're in a small fjord. But I think there's great reasons to go and study turbidity currents in these fjords. And when we do that, it's always in close collaboration with the Canadian Geological Survey, Stacey Cooper and Gwyn Lintern. And what's great about these fjords is they have these beautiful, if this is the bottom of the fjord, and here we see these submarine channels coming down the fjord down to several hundred meters. It's a system of about 40 kilometers long. And it's a great system where you can start to play around with instruments. You don't have the full sea conditions. You don't have the high waves. It is logistically a lot easier. And we have the advantage that this fjord has been mapped for almost 2 decades every year. So we have a very good idea about the morphology and the changes of morphology. So this is a great place to start looking for these turbidity currents. And we're not the first ones here. There's already in the 80s, there have been people that put small impellers down on the ocean floor. Classical work by Pryor and Bjornholt in the 80s. And from the destruction of their sensors, it has always been clear that there's quite a lot of activities in these submarine channels here in Butte Inlet. So this is some of the work that we typically do. We take an ADCP, an acoustic Doppler current profiler, which sends acoustic pulses down to the sea floor, and it listens to the Doppler shift on any of the reflected acoustic waves to measure the velocities of the turbidity currents in the channel. And because Butte is quite shallow, down to 600 meters maximum, we can actually use 2-point moorings, so we can keep the anchors well out of the way of the turbidity currents to prevent them being destroyed by the turbidity currents. And we can still have our acoustic instruments pretty close to the turbidity current, so we have a good idea what it's like. So this is typically what you get. You get some surface buoys, lots of ropes, some small vessels, and then we start deploying these moorings in these submarine channels to try to capture these turbidity currents. So this is what we have deployed in 2016 and 2018. We had 6 moorings down, one completely unconfined, about 40 kilometers away. The first one just off the delta, just off the river, and then a whole bunch of them along the way. And this is what these instruments typically see. They see many turbidity currents that look like this. So this is time or distance, and this is flow depth. So we see this typically, this very turbulent, thick heads, dilute, billowing, very, very similar to the tabletop experiments. From every 100 turbidity currents we measure here, there's about 99 are like these. But what's interesting, about once or twice a year, we see turbidity currents that are quite different. They have They are not very dilute. They seem to be very dense. Their heads are very small, and they go a lot faster than these dilute turbidity currents. So we're very interested in the nature of these kind of flows. And one of the things we can do is we can look at the different turbidity currents, and we can make some estimates on how much sediment they actually carry based on their velocities and their acoustic properties. And then we see that the two types of turbidity currents, they behave very differently. So the dilute flows are here in blue. And what we see is no matter how far from the delta, how far from the start of the system we are, typically these flows have about 1,000 tons of sediment in them. And when we see them somewhere, they typically don't appear in the next mooring. So these dilute flows are very common. We see them a lot, but they don't go very far. But after about 99 of these flows, we have one of these black flows here. They start off very similar at about 1,000 tons of sediment. But then when we see them again, about 10 kilometers further downstream, they have grown by maybe a factor 20. So they have eroded 10 or 19 times as much sediment as they started with. They have really accelerated. And then sometimes, this is maybe once a year, we can see them again down at 30 kilometers, and they start to reach out for this 1,000,000 tons of sediment. So starting still with 1,000, but growing by a factor 100 or maybe even 1,000. So these flows that don't look anything like the flows we see in the lab, they seem to be doing most of the sediment transport. So you have these dilute flows bringing in 99 times more sediment, or they're 99 times more frequent, but then this one flow tidies it all up and brings all that sediment in one go down to the deep. So it's an interesting result, these different flows with these dense heads. It's something we'll come back to when we dive into the next location here. So for this second location, I want to take you to the Monterey Canyon. This is offshore California. It's a very different setting. Here we are mainly in a submarine canyon where the Monterey turbidite system is much longer, but in the current high stand, it is not active that much. So we can only study the first 50 kilometers in the canyon. And here we're building on the classical work of Jingping Su, then at the United States Geological Survey, now at Shenzhen Technical University, or Southern China Technical University. And he was the first one to use these ADCPs, these acoustic Doppler current profilers in canyons, and was able to generate these kind of velocity profiles. So what does the velocity look like in a turbidity current as you go 60 meters away from the seafloor? And at that time, I was still studying turbidity currents in labs, and this was great. This was something that I could actually directly compare with my lab experiments to see whether we were making the same things on the ocean floor as in the lab. Because a turbidity current of 10 centimeters, is that really the same as a turbidity current of 100 meters? And it's interesting, it worked for almost all of these flows, but some of these flows, you see, it has this velocity profile that goes faster and faster for as long as we can see it, and then it sort of disappears. So there is a hint that most of the turbidity currents are like the ones we know from the lab, but then sometimes there are turbidity currents that are different. And based on that work, these organizations have put all their instruments together. This was a project headed up by Charlie Paul in the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Peter Telling then at the Oceanography Center in the UK. And they put all these instruments together on these moorings. They distributed them from the shallow part of the canyon down to about 2 kilometers water depth. So here we see an artist impression of these different instruments going down. And one of the special things there in Monterey Bay is that we have these benthic event detectors. So they are the brainchild of Charlie Paul and his team in Monterey Bay, especially Roberto Guiazdo, who has done a lot of work with these benthic event detectors. These benthic event detectors are sort of balls about this size, and it has several accelerometers inside them. And what's great about that is they can use an ROV to actually bury these benthic event detectors in the canyon floor. And they give very valuable data there, because the acoustic data that we're trying to collect from the top, it only can penetrate the flow for a bit, but when it gets really exciting, we typically don't have enough acoustic energy to penetrate the base of the flow. But these sensors are actually at the base of the flow, so they tell us something that we didn't know. And there at Monterey Bay Aquarium, they have this amazing technology. They have these autonomous surface vehicles that go out, talk to these benthic event detectors, so that you have a sort of a updated map of where your instruments are down the canyon. And they can even then generate these sort of animations which show that when a turbidity current hits, you can see which benthic event detector was activated at what time and what does the motion actually look like. And that's a very powerful way of reconstructing what happens at the base of these turbidity currents. Another thing that came out of this experiment is unintentional. It was by placing this very heavy tripod on the canyon floor. This is a train wheel. It's about 700 kilograms. It's about 3 meters high. And there's one of these benthic event detectors here on the top. And the idea was to put it in the middle of the canyon, and it would have enough weight to just stay there and see if there's any movement in the canyon floor. But then when they tried to find it, they only found it several kilometers further downstream, and all they found was this one leg sticking out of the sea floor. Most of the tripod was actually buried in the sediment. And when they finally managed to pull it out, it had a very interesting damage pattern to it. So what we see here is the benthic event detector here on the top. And what we see is that on one side, it is clearly abraded a lot. While on the other side, it seems like there's hardly any damage. The same if you look at the legs. If you zoom into the lab, you see that the legs are completely bent over, and you can see the signs of abrasion. And then together with the accelerometers, it became clear that this 700 kilogram train was tipped over and then dragged at several meters per second for a few kilometers without actually rotating or turning over or tumbling. And I think that gives us some insight in what it's like to be at the bottom of a turbidity current. The best way we could explain it was that we think there is this really dense layer at the nose and the base of the flow that is capable of actually encasing such a heavy frame and just translating it down. And it sort of matches as well with these benthic event detectors. And when you see this drawing, it reminds you of what we saw in Butte Inlet. Some of these turbidity currents, they don't have those dilute billowing heads that we know from the lab. They must have very dense layers and at the nose. And they must have a very different dynamics than to what we know from the lab. Okay, I'll just leave that there, and I want to continue on to the final location we have here. So now I want to take you to one of the biggest systems in the world. This is the Congo submarine canyon. It comes out of the Congo River here in front of Angola and Congo, and goes for about 1,200 kilometers down to the abyssal plain of the South Atlantic. So this system goes down to water depth in exceedance of 5 kilometers. And here the initial work has all done by Curtis Cooper of Chevron. They wanted to cross this canyon with a pipeline for gas and oil and gas, I think. But before crossing the canyon, they decided to put another one of these acoustic Doppler current profilers in the canyon to just see what happens in the canyon, and is it safe to actually make a pipeline to cross the canyon. And based on what they saw in the ADCP, they decided to invest several $100 million to directionally drill this pipeline from both sides and to have the pipeline actually buried underneath the canyon. They were so afraid of what they found going on in this canyon. And then they didn't have any more need to use that data, and Curtis was retiring. And we were very happy to actually take that data and to work on it. So this is the data they collected. And certainly at that time, I think this was one of the most amazing data sets that I'd ever seen on turbidity currents. And it It was actually enough for one of my former PhD students, Maria Aspiro-Zabala. She looked at this blue square for 4 years and she wrote some incredible papers on it. So let me see if I can get across why I am excited about this data, or certainly then was excited. I think now it's starting to get a bit out of date. What we have here, this is acoustic Doppler current profiler data. What we have here plotted vertically is the height above the seafloor. So the seafloor is here, and the acoustic Doppler current profiler was here 80 meters above the seafloor. And what we have here horizontally is the time. So this instrument, Chevron, put it down for 4 months. And most importantly, what we have is the colors here are velocity. This is in millimeters per second, but it's up to 2 meters per second, or actually this red part is down to 3-4 meters per second. So what this data shows is that it's mainly blue, means no velocity, which sort of makes sense. I mean, this is one of the biggest systems in the world, and we didn't expect there to be a lot of activity in such a big system at the moment. There was previous measurements, and maybe this system is active every 10 years. Maybe there's a big flow every 100 or every 1,000 years or something. So we are expecting this data to be fairly uninteresting and this square to be completely blue. But what's interesting is that there's actually a lot of non-blue here. What we see here is that this turbidity current is active for about 1/3 of the time. So this canyon, one of the biggest canyons we have, is not active every 10 years or every 100 years. This is active 4 months a year. And I think that's a big deal, because that is a direct connection from a jungle-covered basin in Africa straight down to the abyssal plain in the South Atlantic. And this connection is very active. We can look at the scale in a bit more detail here. So if we look at one of these turbidity current episodes here, we can stretch it out to get us some more ID. So let's look at this. So we have again the velocity plotted over the duration and the height. So to get you some ID, here is the facade of the Sagrada de Familia, and this turbidity current would sort of almost cover it. So that's pretty high, right? And then the Congo Canyon is typically 2 kilometers wide. So imagine a flow high like that, 2 kilometers wide, and you have to sit there, and then the flow arrives, and then you have to wait for almost a week for this flow to pass by. I mean, that's a lot of sediment that's transported there, right? And it's not exceptional. It's happening 4 months a year. It's this direct connection straight into the abyssal plain. And it's very different from anything we'd seen before. I mean, this flow lasts 6 days, let's say. And if we compare that to all the other data we had from turbidity currents everywhere in the world, we see typically turbidity currents are maybe minutes to hours. I don't know, maybe half a day. But we've never seen anything like this where it just keeps on going for about a month or so. And then, of course, if we think about the scale, this carries some importance. This turbidity current is rivaling the Mississippi River in its discharge. So there is a lot of sediment, but also organic carbon. There is also plastic. There is pollutants. There's a really large flux connecting the land and the oceans here. And I think it's pretty cool that in this time and age you can still discover things of the size of the Mississippi River on our own planet. And then it becomes interesting if we think back of Butte Inlet or we think back of Monterey. We can start to analyze the structure of this turbidity current and compare it to what we have seen elsewhere. So because clearly this flow is very different. It's much longer, it's much bigger. But again, it's nothing like the lab flows that we typically see. It doesn't have this billowing big head. It seems to be quite the opposite. It has actually quite a thin head with maximum velocities right up into the nose. So we can analyze that in a bit more detail. So here we had the velocity profile again. The next thing we can do is we can actually look at the velocity fluctuations, which is some sort of indication of the amount of turbulence. And what we see is that the velocity fluctuations in the nose are actually pretty low. So this is indicating it's not that billowing turbulent flow that we typically have in mind. And here we have some work by Steve Simmons, an acoustic engineer from Hull University. He used the different acoustic frequencies to try to say something about the amount of sediment and the type of sediment in suspension. And here we see his estimate of the amount of sediment, and again we see a familiar story. We see this peak in sediment concentration right up to that nose again. And then using two different frequencies and using the fact that different frequency responds different to different grain sizes, he could also actually look at the typical grain size that you would find in the flow. And what we see is that typically it's clay. And no surprise there. I think that also explains why this flow is so different from the other ones. It has a lot more clay. But again, if you go to that nose and you go right to the bottom, we see that the really fast bit and the really dense bit and the non-turbulent bit is sandy. Just like in Monterey Canyon, just like Butte Inlet, everywhere we go, we see the same story. So here, it doesn't seem like the turbidity currents are much bigger. We have this very small thing, this nose that sort of shoots down to the abyssal plane, and it's like a car driving on a dusty road. This is a comparison of Esther Sumner, where she said it's like a car driving on a dusty road, throwing up all this dust behind it, and the dust behind it is the clay. And the clay is typically forming this turbulent, dilute flow that we know so well from all our textbooks. And it's easy to measure and it's abundant, but actually, if you want to understand it, we probably need to understand what's happening in this sandy nose. So we try to find that out by actually doing setting up a bigger project. This is a project led by Peter Telling at Durham University, where they went back to the Congo Canyon, and actually we have the instruments down there now. Fingers crossed they're still there and pinging, but this was the first of them to put instruments there. So they put them down in 2019, just before the pandemic. And here we have some of the data. So this is the ADCP data, very similar to the blue square I told you about before. The instrument was a bit closer to the seafloor, now at 35 meters above the seafloor. And it was down there for, again, 4 or 5 months or something like that. But the interesting thing is now we didn't have one mooring as we had from the old Chevron data, but we actually had 7 moorings all the way from 100 kilometers offshore all the way down to 1150 kilometers offshore. So this is really at 5 kilometers water depth. And then initially we saw a turbidity current, and what we typically see is the turbidity current is picked up by the first couple of moorings about 100, 200 kilometers offshore. And that seems to be fairly typical in the Congo Canyon. We have these flows and they run out for a couple of 100 kilometers and then we don't see them again. But things get interesting here in January. In January, we see the first signal where turbidity current makes it all the way down to M6. So this one runs down to about 1,000 kilometers. And then towards the end of January, things get very interesting as Peter Telling starts to get emails, because as soon as these moorings are destroyed by something, they float up and they start to send emails saying, okay, I'm on the surface, come and pick me up. And he first gets an email of this mooring, and then this mooring, and this mooring, and this mooring, until all the moorings popped up. So something has gone down the canyon and has just destroyed all our moorings. And it's at this time that we get this similar message that internet slows down from Nigeria to South Africa as major submarine telecommunication cables break. The SAT cable, the WEX cable here. So this is an interesting event that is caught here, and I'm very impressed by Pete Telling, who actually managed in the middle of the pandemic to get a ship to pick up these moorings in early 2020 before they run out of batteries and they stop sharing the location. And later it turns out that indeed two of the main telecommunication cables that cross the Congo submarine canyon have been broken by this event, just like all our moorings here. And then the interesting bit is this plot. So here we compare, in as far as we can, these observations with what we have previously seen in the Congo Canyon. So in this plot, we plot the transit speed. Typically, our instruments are destroyed, so we don't really know, we don't have direct measurements of the speed of the flow, but we do know when this mooring was destroyed and this mooring, and we know how far it is, so we have at least an estimate of the average velocity between the moorings. So if we look back at the older data and some of the French data, the Chevron data, we see that typically here at about 100, 200 kilometers offshore, we have these flows between 0 and 4 meters a second. These flows, they go for a couple hundred kilometers and then they typically disappear. And then halfway January, or some of the older data actually shows that it's not uncommon for flows to maybe start slightly higher, maybe 5 meters per second. And then they gradually lose their velocity as they go downstream, which makes sense. As that canyon gets wider and wider and it opens up and the gradients become shallower and shallower, you would expect this flow to slow down because it's driven by gravity. So if the gradient slows down, these turbidity currents should slow down. So no surprise there. But then look at what this recent flow did. This recent flow left the coast with a velocity of maybe just over 5 meters a second. And then when the canyon opens up and when the gradient goes down, this flow doesn't care. It just speeds up. And the fastest we've seen it is actually most distal, where it's unconfined or almost unconfined. It's traveling on the abyssal plane and it's doing so at a speed of over 8 meters a second. And this really had us puzzled and still has us puzzled. How does that work? How can you reduce the gradient by a factor 10 or 20 and this flow has then 20 times less energy, yet it goes double the speed. So this is one of the main reasons that we went back. So we went back last year, put some more moorings and sampled the deposits of this flow to try to understand what happened here, and of course map the morphology again and see where the sediment is missing here. Right, so I'll leave it at that. I'll just draw some conclusions here. I hope that I've convinced you that we need to study the ocean floor, basically any sediment transport process in the ocean floor, but for us it's mainly the turbidity currents. And that I think by monitoring and mapping the ocean floor, we can start to validate and calibrate the existing engineering and geological models. And I think one of the main things we're starting to learn so far is that turbidity currents can have these very dense heads that are very different from the current experimental work. So maybe as experimentalists, we should start to think of ways to actually scale this down to our lab. Because the dilute flows we know very well, they happen a lot, but they don't do the majority of the sediment transport. It seems like the majority of the sediment transport is done by these other type of turbidity currents. We have seen that turbidity current systems can be surprisingly active and flows can be surprisingly long. And the systems, yeah, they can be active much more frequently than we previously thought. I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much for your attention.
Have questions? Yeah, I think you have to use that.
Please.
I really like it. I'm not a marine geologist. I work in the lakes, but the process are more or less the same. And they have you don't know exactly what's triggering this kind of high density turbidity currents. You have no idea what's the process triggering them.
No, that's well, it's an interesting question, and it sort of depends on the system we're in. We know in Butte Inlet, in the Canadian, the small system, it is low water spring tide with a high river flux when the snow melt is at its maximum around May. But we know that triggers turbidity currents, but we cannot predict which of these turbidity currents become the big one. There seems to be, initially, there's nothing special about the one that becomes very big, or at least not that we know. So they seem to start off pretty similar, and they don't really care too much about the trigger. It must be something in the marine system is ready for them to bulk up, and but yeah, we don't really understand. And Monterey is very similar. It's very hard to predict in Monterey. Storms do sometimes trigger turbidity currents, but it's not necessarily that the biggest storm produces the bigger turbidity current. And Congo is surprisingly very similar in its trigger to the Canadian system. So it's when the Congo River had the 1 in 60-year flood in 2020 when we had this big flow. So we had the biggest flood causing the biggest flow, but they were, I think, 2 weeks apart. So 2 weeks after the peak flood, this big flow happened. And it happened at low water spring tide. And then I think a couple of low water spring tides further, it happened again. So maybe in Congo, there is something where big floods transport a lot of sediment that then just sits there and wait for low water spring tides to fail, or we don't know.
So a particular period of the year that you can have this kind of big floods. I mean,
yeah, no. So we do, but we cannot guarantee that during the big flood there will be the big flow. So in Butte Inlet, we can go May, June. There will be turbidity currents, maybe big ones. And in Congo, the same. There is Congo has this double peak because it's on both sides of the equator. So it has 2 flood peaks, and it's most likely to have turbidity currents there. But the big one, you don't know. So so we cannot predict the big ones, but we start to understand when the system is active. And I think in lakes, this will be even more closer linked to the river, I guess, because you don't need to overcome that density difference. So you can have these hyperpycnal conditions immediately.
lake systems now, what we are seeing is that because of this global change, the frequency of the floods starts to increase. So and the turbidity systems, they are denser and bigger. So maybe should add something like that. Right. I mean, the rainfall pattern starts to change.
Yes.
Maybe something is happening.
Yeah, we can see that. Well, at least in Canada, the snow melt and the amount of snow is becoming different due to climate change, and we see that in the turbidity currents. I don't know the history of this once in 60-year flood in Congo, whether that is part of a systematic trend or not, but so there I don't know.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Another question?
Thanks very much for this. Is it working?
Yeah, it's for
Okay.
So thanks very much for the talk. I have to confess that I'm the sort of scientist that always is running away from the turbidites because I work in polyphenolography, so we're trying to avoid them. But it is fascinating, that information. I have a couple of questions in leadership, but also I wanted to comment that I'm very pleased to see Maria here.
Oh, yes.
She was a former student of master. I think some of us here
Oh, okay.
have her in the classroom. And it was I remember very well the very first day when she told me she was an engineer. I thought, what is an engineer doing here in a master of marine sciences? And she did a big change and she was very motivated in the studies. So I'm very pleased that she ended up doing such an interesting PhD.
Yeah, oh, she was amazing. Yeah.
I was very surprised about this exercise you did transfer the information about, I don't know whether it was electricity signal or system, transferring to grand size. What's acoustic data?
Yeah.
What's acoustic data?
Mhm.
And you can translate to clay, silt, sand. But did you actually, will you have the opportunity to test with direct measurements, or do you have the examples then of these sedimentary bodies, or is that possible?
Yeah, now we have. So I collected those samples in March last year. We were actually doing CTD dips close to the shore close to the mouth of the Congo River. And then it turned out that the turbidity current was actually happening and it was not very powerful. So we could lower the CTD and the carousel and we just took samples. So the samples we have, they are now in the UK at my lab, but I haven't touched them yet. So yes, we have the samples and I'm also excited that we can start testing some of this. But it's very much work in progress. And reality is that we only collected those samples in a very slow part of the flow and the dilute part of the flow, you know, the flows that we know actually pretty well. Because if you try to lower anything in that frontal part, let's go 4, 5, maybe 8 meters a second, that will just be destroyed. Yeah, ground truthing those acoustic measurements there where it counts is still very difficult, and I don't think we're gonna solve that anytime soon, I'm afraid.
The last sample you showed is very amazing that all these flows increasing through going down to the slope. To what extent grand size could have a role on that behavior? The fact that probably more material, more incorporated into the flow, and the waves, and helping us so probably trying to understand the behavior of the sedimentology and the grand size of these turbulence.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very surprising.
Yeah. No,
exactly.
Yeah. No, I think grain size must play a part, and it's we often have discussions about that because we don't really know how, because this turbidity current goes down the Congo Canyon. It picks up lots of sand, but also lots of mud. And it seems like there must be a mechanism where it picks up everything, and then probably the sand sort of sticks there and sources this acceleration, and the mud presumably goes up and then falls back, so it starts to feed into that large cloud following it. So it seems like it picks up all grain sizes, because that we can see from the erosion and we know what sediment is there. And then there must be some sort of internal grain size separation mechanism that then feeds it. And we can speculate about that, but we don't really know, except that we know that the nose is sandy and the body is clayey. Yeah.
Question? No?
One.
Yeah.
Good one. Thank you for the presentation. But is salinity or temperature, for example, changing in these turbidity flows? Because you only talked about turbidity and the other parameters.
Yes, it is. But it's not that common for us to measure it, to be honest. We are working with some of the temperature and salinity data in the Monterey Canyon, where we do have quite a lot of measurements from it, and it's quite interesting because it starts off much warmer and fresher than the surrounding water, And by measuring it in different moorings, we can actually start to get a grip on how much of the surrounding water gets in, and does it get in the nose or in the top, and we can follow it down. And what we see is that the ambient water rapidly entrains into the flow and all parts of the flow, but the top more than the bottom. So at the bottom of the flow, you have a body that is consistently warmer and fresher than the surrounding water and goes down. This is what we have so far.
That's super interesting. Any question? Any other question? Well, I have many, but maybe I'll leave it for the lunch.
Just a question. What is the role of the blood beer?
Mm.
So you have a picture of that, and you say to your colleague.
Yeah.
That's really amazing.
No, in Butte Inlet, we always stay in this this lumberjack camp, and there's two accommodation, the one with the kitchen and the one with sleeping. In the middle, there's this cherry tree, and this bear is always in the cherry tree when the snow melts. So we always have to be very careful walking beneath the cherry tree. So for us, he is an integral part of our field experiments, which is why he's here. Yes.
One very last question. How do you deal with insurance enterprises?
Sorry?
With the insurances of your instruments?
Yeah, we don't have insurance, which sometimes can be very costly, but I'm sure if you would pitch it to an insurance company, I don't know what they would charge you, but yeah, I think we accept that sometimes we lose instruments there. I think that's common around marine sciences, right? You try to get it back, but sometimes you lose things. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure. Yeah.